folks. It's time for the fourth episode of Toke TV, your source for the biggest cannabis stories of the week. We have a full slate of them this week, and it's a big week in the cannabis community. Seattle Hemp Fest happens this weekend, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. It's a three-day event, August 16th, 17th, and 18th. So that will dominate the stories this week. However, there's plenty of other exciting things happening too. But before we dive into the news, let's look at our bud pick of the week. What we have is a 2-gram chunk here of Purple Arrow, which is an indica dominant strain. I found this at a dispensary in the Shoreline community just north of Seattle on Aurora Avenue. And you can see here that it is a very compact and dense flower. It's very effective for pain and nausea. It's a good nighttime strain, as you might get a little bit sleepy if you smoke very much of it. It's available for $10 a gram. They're at Pacific Northwest Medical on Aurora Avenue and Shoreline. So let's go into the news. Seattle Hemp Fest. It's the world's largest marijuana protestival. It's hitting Seattle this weekend, and as many as 250,000 people are expected to attend the three-day rally. Prohibition, of course, has been a catastrophic failure, as Executive Director Vivian McPeak of HempFest tells us. And this gathering is going to demand the removal of cannabis from Schedule 1, where the federal government has classified it alongside things like heroin and LSD. Schedule 1 drugs aren't supposed to have any medical applications, and they're supposed to have a high potential for abuse. So that's how your federal government considers marijuana. You might find it interesting that down on Schedule 2, considered less dangerous than marijuana, they have cocaine and methamphetamine. So that's how much they know about it. You need to keep that in mind when you're gauging how much stock to put in federal pronouncements about marijuana. Anyway, back at HempFest, it's in its 22nd year. There are 6 stages of speakers and music. There's 400 booths with arts, crafts, food, vendors. And this year, for the first time ever, they're going to have something called the Gut Check, which aims to reduce marijuana use by young people. Vivian McPeak says that they're going to be messaging to youth with 8 specialized cards that address various aspects of harm reduction when it comes to marijuana. And these cards will basically give the message that young people should not smoke pot. According to McPeak, they should wait until they have physically, mentally, and emotionally developed before they try marijuana. So that will be a new message at HempFest. I'm going to be speaking all 3 days at HempFest this year. If you want to catch me, here are the times that you can do so. I'm going to speak on the Sealy stage on Friday the 16th. That's scheduled for 6:35 p.m. Sealy stage. I'll speak from the main stage at HempFest on Saturday the 17th at 5:50 p.m. And I'll speak from the McWilliams stage on Sunday the 18th at 1:45 in the afternoon. I hope to see you there. It would be great if you want to come up and say hi to me before or after the speech. I would be delighted if you choose to do that. Looking forward to seeing all of you. Now, according to Vivian, costs are outstripping donations at HempFest, so it would be great when you go in the gate. There are donation buckets available there, and if everybody could put $10 or more in those, HempFest will be paid for this year. Last year, the average donation per attendee at HempFest was something pitifully low. It was like 30 cents or something way down there. We can do better than that. Let's pull together as a community and make sure that HempFest happens again next year. Now, on the HempFest tip, there are a couple of things to be aware of. Let's look at a happy one first. Here's something that's never happened before, and that could only happen in a few places. The Seattle Police Department is going to be handing out free Doritos to the stoners at HempFest. That seems like a very good thing, and it's a change that I am very happy to see. When the voters back in November decided to legalize marijuana with I-502, along with that came pages and pages of rules and regulations that only a cop or a lawyer could love. What the cops would like to do with this public awareness campaign of handing out the free Doritos at HempFest is to increase awareness of those rules so that people can be educated on how to avoid breaking them. Doritos are a good way to get someone's attention when they have the munchies, and the labels on these snack-sized bags are going to direct festival attendees to the Seattle Police Department's post-legalization frequently asked questions site online. It's called What Now? A Guide to Legal Marijuana Use in Seattle. You can find the link to that site on my Hemp News story. It went viral last November, and it is very useful. Seattle Police spokesman Sean Whitcomb said, "Distributing salty facts at a festival celebrating hemp, I think, is a deliberately ironic enough that people will accept them in good humor. We want to make sure people learn the rules and that they respect the vote." And of course, those labels will remind the HempFest attendees that while possessing up to an ounce of marijuana is now legal in Washington state, selling it or growing it remains quite illegal. Now, a handful of $1,000 growing and retail licenses will be issued later this year by the state under a lottery, but no home growing is allowed under I-502. And my guess is those Doritos labels aren't going to mention two things that are still illegal under I-502: smoking marijuana in public and passing the joint to a friend. Both of those are still illegal, but both of those activities are going to be heavily indulged in by practically everyone in the park this weekend. So over 100,000 people are going to be doing that. Unless you really manage to make a cop unhappy, you're not going to get busted for that, even though it is still against the law under I-502. We still have work to do. Marijuana is not completely legal yet, but there will be a celebration of what we've accomplished so far and a statement of determination to go the rest of the way to the end zone this weekend in Seattle. Now, as far as news that isn't quite as happy surrounding HempFest, the Washington State Patrol plans to put extra DUI patrols on the road starting the weekend of HempFest. That is probably not a coincidence, people. You're going to have up to 200,000 expected in town for HempFest. So if a cop happened to be looking to make some marijuana DUI arrests, which they can now make if you exceed 5 nanograms per milliliter of active THC in your bloodstream under I-502, because our legalization measure also included a DUI provision, they're going to have a target-rich environment in the Seattle area this weekend. So please have a designated driver. Be careful. You can get arrested for marijuana DUI. The Drive Sober campaign runs from August 16th through September the 2nd. And it will especially focus on catching drivers who have been smoking marijuana. And this is according to the Washington State Patrol. Officers can tell when a driver is experiencing other effects of marijuana, they tell us, such as relaxed inhibitions, altered perception of time and distance, disorientation, incomplete thought processes, and increased pulse. That may sound sort of scary and apocalyptic and clueless, but then again, that does come from law enforcement, so draw your own conclusions. Washington state voters, when they approved marijuana legalization, also approved that new DUI limit of 5 nanograms per milliliter, whereas impairment had previously been based on actual impairment rather than an artificial number. Unfortunately, 5 nanograms seems to have little evidence to back it up as a measure of actual impairment and can easily result in unimpaired drivers being charged with DUI. So I implore all of you to be careful this weekend and any time that you happen to drive. Don't drive while you smoke. You can get a ticket for that. Another interesting thing that will be happening this weekend at Seattle Hemp Fest will be announcement of the 420 Leaks project, which is a fascinating project, a media project that sprung from board meetings of Seattle activist group, the Cannabis Action Coalition, which is focused primarily on patient protection. The website, 420leaks.org, was launched in July this year by John Novak, and they have contributors including Steve Surich and Arthur West and John Worthington of the Cannabis Action Coalition. Its purpose, according to Novak, is to act as both a government and an industry watchdog group and expose the public and news media to a new approach to the drug war. What they're trying to do to us now is restrictive zoning and licensing that favors corporations over people. They're going with unscientific DUI laws, as we were just mentioning, that guarantee more convictions of non-impaired drivers. And they're using federal contracts such as high-intensity drug trafficking area contracts, HIDTA, to get around state cannabis laws in states that have relaxed their laws, such as Washington. Now, according to Novak, 420 Leaks researchers have gotten this information primarily through public records requests and through daily monitoring of all the various state bills, local ordinances, and news that have to do with marijuana. They will be having a Hemposium panel that will be worth attending there at HempFest on Saturday at 3 in the afternoon. Mr. Novak will be a part of that panel, and it's going to be activism how-to, how you can make a difference. So that will be an event 3 in the afternoon on Saturday at HempFest that you might want to attend if you want to sharpen your activism skills. Now to move on to non-HempFest news in the cannabis world, we had some really good news from Oregon this week. Governor Kitzhaber there in Oregon, John Kitzhaber, signed a bill which legalizes medical marijuana dispensaries in Oregon. This comes at long last because 15 years ago it was, in 1998, when Oregon voters decided to legalize marijuana for medical purposes. Since that time, though, patients have had to either grow it themselves or appoint a designated caregiver to grow it for them. And since many of these patients are seriously ill, that really doesn't make it very practical for some of them to grow their own. Now at last they will be able to go in retail establishments without those being considered gray market. Now there have been dispensaries operating in Oregon in certain tolerant areas, such as the area immediately surrounding Portland. But in much of the rest of the state, patients haven't had safe access. So dispensaries being legal is a very good thing. The Oregon Health Authority is going to be in charge of drafting rules for the new dispensary registry. All the dispensaries in the state will have to register with the state. And they're still working out exactly how that's going to go forward. The Health Authority has until next March, to draft the rules on security, on cannabis potency testing and purity testing and other issues. The bill had initially included a provision which limits criminal liability for existing dispensaries. As I mentioned, some are already operating in a gray area. But the Oregon Prosecutors Association successfully got that part taken out. Dispensary operators in Oregon will be allowed to set their own prices. The price may reflect the cost of doing business, including costs related to the transferring, handling, security, insuring, testing, packaging, and processing of usable marijuana and immature marijuana plants, and the cost of supplies, utilities, rent, or mortgage. Good news from Oregon, and congratulations to all the patients and the activists who worked so hard to make that happen. Meanwhile, here in Washington State, we have the Liquor Control Board in charge of implementing the legalization measure approved by voters last November, I-502. And what they told us this week is that they need more time to come up with the proposed rules for legal marijuana in Washington. But according to the Cannabis Action Coalition, who we mentioned in connection to the 420 Leaks story, while their press release described it as business as usual, the new delay actually reflects a botched administrative procedure and a defective environmental review under the State Environmental Policy Act, according to Steve Sarich of the CAC. Under the current schedule, the board was expected to adopt final rules at its regularly scheduled meeting, and that would have been yesterday. But what they asked for was more time. They said they will need more time to incorporate feedback from the public, which they've gotten since filing the proposed rules on July the 3rd. Now, what they say now is that they will have the new rules in place still by December the 1st as required by law. But that actually is in some doubt at this point, because it appears they forgot to file an environmental impact statement. That's what it looks like. They aren't saying that. But at their public hearings, critics argued that there was just no way the board could determine that the proposed rules for marijuana in Washington have no potential for significant impacts. And since they hadn't filed an environmental impact statement, that is going to probably prove a significant logjam in the way of going forward. The Liquor Control Board's own records were cited to demonstrate that the board's environmental review, once it happened, was cursory and post-dated the actual rules themselves. What they did was rush to get one done when it was pointed out that they hadn't done one. And that's clearly in violation of the procedural requirements of the State Environmental Protection Act. So what we'll have to see now is how the Liquor Control Board goes forward, if they stay on schedule, and how that will happen. Rumor has it that a home growing amendment will be introduced to the legislature in January. If that happens and the rules still aren't in place by January, if they've fallen that far behind, that would make yet more things the Liquor Control Board would have to consider in their rules process. So that couldn't take place for 90 days following the time any new laws impacting I-502 are passed. So bottom line, this could mean significant delays for the implementation of retail marijuana establishments in Washington state. And that's a story we'll continue to keep a close eye on. A big happening this week, of course, was Dr. Sanjay Gupta's weed special on CNN. It got a lot of attention, and many people who hadn't previously considered the effectiveness of medical marijuana are now probably doing so because of his mainstream endorsement of it. He followed up on that special, which we covered last week, by appearing on an interview with Anderson Cooper, in which he slammed the United States federal government's policies on medical marijuana, which he called hypocrisy. According to Dr. Gupta, the United States holds a patent on marijuana on one hand, and on the other hand, that same government says it has no medical applications. Now, why do they have the medical patent if it has no medical uses? Journalists are trained to hate hypocrisy, Gupta said. This is hypocrisy. I've never seen it quite like this. Dr. Gupta explained that the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services holds a patent on medical marijuana as a protectant for the brain. Marijuana is a neuroprotectant. It protects your brain cells from damage. But the government classifies cannabis as a Schedule I drug, which by definition, Schedule I means it has no accepted medical uses. The government's own patent on cannabis states that cannabinoids are found to have particular application as neuroprotectants, for example, in limiting neurological damage following ischemic insults such as stroke and trauma, or in the treatment of neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and HIV dementia. Dr. Gupta is right to point out the hypocrisy of the federal position, which some of us have been harping on for years. It's great to have him on our team, and maybe, finally, marijuana can be taken off Schedule I and eventually taken off the schedule of controlled substances entirely. From Texas, we have a story that would be amusing if it weren't so dismaying. The cops down in Arlington, Texas, apparently are pretty gung-ho about eradicating marijuana in that town. And they had heard rumors that a hippie commune there in Arlington had been growing and smoking pot. So what they did was, at great expense, I understand it cost about $3,000 an hour to hire a helicopter. They flew over this hippie commune in a helicopter, spying on these people. They decided they were growing pot, and they go in there with a SWAT team and raid the place. Now, they could really use some brushing up on their drug recognition techniques, because all they found in what they called a pot field was a bunch of tomatoes. Garden of Eden resident Quinn Baker told the news they can't even tell the difference between tomato plants and marijuana. Several residents of the 3.5-acre sustainability garden were handcuffed at gunpoint by the police during the raid. They came here under the guise that we were doing drug trafficking and marijuana growing. Owner Shelley Smith told the news they destroyed everything. The cops took away their food and everything they needed for a sustainable lifestyle. According to Smith, they've been targeted by the system because we're showing people how to live without it. We're growing more than just tomatoes here, Smith said. We're growing the consciousness that will allow people to live freely and sustainably, and the system doesn't want that to be known. According to Eaker, we live a very peaceful life here. We've never hurt anybody. This is our land. We have the right to be secure in our person and our property. Members of the commune want an apology from the police. I'm not sure that will be forthcoming. But what has happened was that the police department there in Arlington, Texas, has gotten an enormous amount of bad publicity, and the drug war looks just as ridiculous as it truly is. In New York this week, a federal judge ruled the stop and frisk policy, often employed by the New York Police Department, especially on young minority males, to be unconstitutional. These controversial stop and frisk tactics by the NYPD violate constitutional rights and must be changed, the federal judge ruled on Monday. The ruling from Judge Shira A. Scheinlein results from a class action lawsuit alleging that NYPD officers routinely stop minority men, particularly blacks and Latinos, without legally defensible reasons. An outside monitor will be appointed to oversee changes to the NYPD policy, according to Judge Scheinlein. The police tried to claim that the controversial policy in which they stop, question, and search people they consider suspicious helps to deter crime, but the practice is widely criticized, especially because of its use primarily against minorities. The lead plaintiff in the case is medical student David Floyd. He was stopped twice, once in the middle of the afternoon right in front of his Bronx home, according to the 2008 lawsuit. The trial ended back in May after 9 weeks of testimony, and it featured testimony both from police officers who revealed quotas forced them to make unnecessary stops, and from men who said that the police stopped them for no reason. Attorneys for one New York City man said that he was simply talking on his cell phone when he was stopped, detained, and searched by the police because they said he appeared to be smoking marijuana. The NYPD logged its 5 millionth stop and frisk under Mayor Michael Bloomberg last March, according to the New York Civil Liberties Union. It's great that these stop and frisk searches have been ruled unconstitutional. Now the NYPD bears careful monitoring to make sure they follow this judge's order. U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder this week on Monday called for major drug sentencing reforms. In a Monday speech to the American Bar Association, Holder announced major federal sentencing changes, including dropping the use of mandatory minimum sentencing in certain drug cases. That could expedite the release of nonviolent elderly prisoners. It could leave more offenses to state courts to deal with, and Holder says that he hopes to work with Congress to pass bipartisan sentencing reform. In the future, according to Holder, many low-level charges against dealers not judged to be part of a large gang or a cartel would no longer depend on how much they were caught with. That will sidestep the federal minimum sentencing laws that were passed back in the Get Tough Reagan 80s, and which subsequently, of course, filled our prisons with nonviolent drug offenders. Holder said that we must never stop being tough on crime, but we must also be smarter on crime. He's right about that because the United States right now has 25% of the world's prison inmates. 25%, 1/4 of everyone in prison on earth is in prison right here in the United States. We have just 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's prisoners. There's something wrong here. Drug-related offenses drive most of these. Millions of dollars, of course, are wasted in warehousing and keeping these people in prison, not to mention the enormous human tragedy of lost potential and broken families that every one of these cases represents. Sentencing reform is a step forward away from the war on drugs and towards a human progressive stance, but it isn't enough. Eventual complete legalization is the only thing that can solve the drug war. Speaking of prison, an interesting story from Switzerland this week that marijuana helps keep their prisons safe, allowing prison inmates to smoke marijuana. Now, that's an idea that makes so much sense, it would probably never be implemented anywhere, right? Well, wrong. The sensible Swiss have already done it. A recent study published in the International Journal of Drug Policy estimates that 50 to 80% of inmates in Swiss prisons use cannabis regularly. Prison staff say that marijuana is a relatively safe drug, and cracking down on its consumption would have more negative effects than positive ones, so it's largely tolerated. They look the other way. 31 male prisoners were interviewed in the study, along with 27 members of prison staff, 9 of whom were female. Both the guards and the prisoners described marijuana as a calming way to decrease the trauma of the prison experience. Survey participants agreed that a crackdown could increase fear and result in a shift to harder drug use. 80% of inmates use marijuana, according to the inmates themselves. The guards estimated at 50%. In any event, it's very revealing that both prison staff and inmates regard marijuana as overall a positive factor in prison life. Is it too much to expect that someday we might have enlightened prison policies in the United States? I hope not. Let's do what we can about that. As far as stories that you should miss this week, first of all, I would like to share with you a visual, which I did this week, about cannabis and big pharma. It's time for a simple truth about that. 106,000 Americans die each year from taking the pharmaceuticals their doctors prescribed and told them they needed. 106,000 a year. That's a big football stadium full of people. Now, for comparison, 0 people died this year or ever in history from using cannabis. Yet pharmaceuticals are legally approved and people are still put in prison for cannabis. We got to fix this. Medical cannabis somehow is supposed to be controversial, while the big pharmaceutical corporations rake in record profits and result in a body count of 106,000 a year with their often addictive, often ineffective, sometimes fatal products. I know what I choose to combat nausea and pain and to aid wellness, relaxation, and centeredness. And if you would like to educate yourself on the differences between big pharmaceuticals products and organic natural marijuana, that would be a very positive step you can take for your own health. Another story not to miss this week is from our valued contributor, Ron Marczyk, who used to be an NYPD cop. He used to be a high school health teacher. And he is an all-around great guy who is one of the most knowledgeable people I know when it comes to cannabis. He was also an RN. Ron Marczyk knows what he's talking about when he tells you about cannabis. In this week's Toke Signals, he tells you 7 cannabis studies that will change everything. What he does basically is round up some medical papers on various things that he's been able to find in the past couple of years, including cancer and colon cancer prevention, inflammatory bowel disease, irritable bowel syndrome, colitis, and Crohn's disease, nausea from chemotherapy, osteoporosis, traumatic brain injury, and heart disease. And surprisingly, every single one of these can be addressed in one way or another by the medical use of marijuana and the cannabinoids found therein. The reason that all these diverse conditions, of course, can be addressed by marijuana is that you have cannabinoid receptors found throughout your body. And that's the reason for the broad applications of this herb. Speaking of cannabinoids and health, the tragic case which we covered last week of a 2-year-old little girl who was murdered in foster care after being taken from her parents because the father had smoked marijuana in the home after the little girl was in bed has been weighing heavily on my mind. It's also been bringing renewed and urgent attention to the policy of taking children out of their homes where cannabis is used or grown. And I remembered a study from a couple years ago that bears directly on this question. I decided to bring it back out this week and give it more publicity, and it has reached many of you. It's headed towards 4K Facebook shares. What I pointed out was a largely overlooked 2011 study from Canada. And this study flies in the face of stereotypes regarding the offspring of marijuana-growing parents. Children from homes where cannabis is grown were found to be healthy and drug-free, according to the study. In fact, healthier than other children, leading to questions about why such kids are often removed from their homes. After examining 75 of the kids over several years, we came to very clear conclusions that a vast majority of these kids are doing well, said Dr. Gideon Corin. He's the Ivy Chair in Molecular Toxicology at Western University's Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry. They're at Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children. He said the children were well fed, well kept, doing well in school, and developing well. And in fact, Dr. Corin said the health problems found in this population of kids were actually fewer than those in the general Canadian population. These kids often enjoy the lifestyle benefits as well from living with their parents, even though their income was in many cases made illegally. And taking them away, Dr. Corin says, does a lot of damage. Taking a small child from his or her parents in a well-adapted environment causes fear, anxiety, confusion, and sadness. Everything that comes from separation, he said. We have to develop a more customized and comprehensive process to determine the response to cases like this. And we have to realize that just because parents choose to use cannabis in their own home, that doesn't mean that they are bad parents. It doesn't mean that they're bad people. And it certainly doesn't mean that that child needs to be taken out of that home. Now, let's remember that this weekend is one of the biggest of the year for the cannabis community. Let's celebrate all of the accomplishments that we've had over the past year. It's been a big year for cannabis. It's going to be a big weekend for cannabis. I hope to see you at Seattle Hemp Fest. Come up and say hi. And don't forget to send in your bud pick of the week to tokesignals@gmail.com. Your bud can be a star. Until next week, stay lifted. I'll see you then.